Wonderful good morning at what is usually the best time at the university. This is when all the great work that especially our students did is coming to an end. We're in the middle of defenses. Everybody's excited. Graduation is next week. So this is really, I love this time the most. And this time it's even better because we have Seteney Shami, Professor Seteney Shami, speaking in our seminar as the last in a very, I would say, very inspiring series that we had this year, where we started with lectures and discussions, striking from the margins in Indonesia and looking at how models of violence, of networks, of entangled networks were crisscrossing from one part of the continent of this planet to another. And we started really from the margins in Indonesia, but by and by, via a detour via Africa and a fascinating lecture by Professor Don Kalb, an anthropologist, we slowly really approached what is at the heart of our own research project, that is Syria and Iraq in particular, but the Middle East at large. Therefore, we couldn't think of anybody better to really speak to us today or discuss with us. We just agreed that Seteney will certainly speak and address the seminar first in a more formal way, but that the intention is really to engage in a discussion that we are looking at with Seteney at gaps, elisions, and glosses in the study of the Arab Middle East in the social sciences. And I'm emphasizing that it's the social sciences because we obviously have quite a different output and very different, how shall I say, a presence and permanence if we compare historical studies, for instance, on the Middle East, which seem to have since a very good time actually really penetrated into the mainstream historiography and into the various associations. Social sciences, I'm saying this as an outsider, seem to be still struggling very actively, but also starting to provide really new ideas, new concepts, really participating in the formulation of paradigms or rethinking paradigms. As Wallerstein tells us, we should rethink all paradigms. But there is a lot going on, and that there is so much going on now in social sciences, and that we really see a very active participation, not just a one-way reception of ideas, theories, methods, be they quantitative or qualitative, has a lot to do with the fact that in the Arab world we have an Arab Council for the Social Sciences. This is an institution, and we know this very well, not least at this institution. We know what it means to have institutions that are there to provide not only an institutional structure, but also a safe haven for critical thinking. And the Arab Social Science, or the Arab Council for Social Science, I see as such an institution in the Middle East. Founding directress, not alone, the founding directress of the council in 2010 was Seteney, who is running since 2012 as director this council, and in that very short period, which as we all know for an institution is not a very long time, has already really left its mark on the scholarship in the region, on the kind of questions that it either brings in the region, connecting to ongoing questions that are of pertinence and relevance in other fields, but also formulating questions that really come from within the region. And in that sense, Beirut has re-emerged indeed as a center, an academic center of sciences. We have, of course, wonderful universities there that have worked on, including during the Civil War, have never stopped functioning and producing great scholarship, but you need these hubs and these hotspots where something can really receive another push. And this cannot be done without really the leadership of a good team and the leader. Now, Seteney Shami is indeed not only a directress of the council, and she has served on various councils and boards before, not least to mention, because some of you are familiar with this SSRC in New York, right? This is, I think, from where the whole thing started, and has earned in that context working with Mellon, Carnegie, with various institutes for advanced studies. I'm not listing them all, but one I like in particular, because they're good friends of our own institute here, is CATS in Uppsala, where you spent some time. Seteney is, of course, also a scholar in her own right. She studied anthropology, earned her PhD in Berkeley, the early 80s, and has, apart from holding positions in the US, but all worked for a long time and taught an entire generation of students, some of them I know very well, has taught a new generation of anthropologists, right, at the University of Yarmouk, right? You've been there for 10 years, no?
Even more.
Even more. So I don't want to give now that. She has been very influential in not only continuing projects on anthropology that were there, but really inspiring anthropology in Jordan, and from there it very quickly spread in the region that would connect as well with the newer questions that we've seen at other great universities, as the one where Seteney earned her PhD. So she's published wide and large on questions from family, let me see that I don't get this wrong, family and gender, ethnicity and nationalism, forced migration, urban politics and policies, and her focus, her regional focus is, as I said, on the Middle East, but what really also marks Seteney's work is that she has intimate knowledge, including linguistic, of the Caucasus and Central Asia. And that is, as we know very well, a rare combination and something that has really added to the strength of her work. So without could go on now very long, as a very impressive CV, I shall stop at this point and let you hear Seteney. How long would you want to speak?
I was told 1 hour, which seemed really long.
No, you can.
I can always talk, but maybe I'll do something like 40 minutes.
Yes,
45 minutes would be
yeah.
comfortable.
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
and then raise some issues.
Yeah,
we could
perfect.
talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Do you want me there or here?
What is more comfortable for you there? I think it's more agreeable to keep your paper, and if you want to prefer to sit, the camera catches you wherever you are.
Oh, okay.
So it's really up to you. So thank you for coming. Please welcome with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia. I think the last time I was here was for the roundtable, the workshop you had on Central Asia.
Yes.
And the Caucasus, so it's a pleasure to be back. That was already maybe 10 years ago, so it's been a while. But I came to CEU several times actually with the SSRC as well. We had meetings of our regional advisory board that worked on Eastern Europe and Eurasia and so on, and we had several meetings here at CEU. So it's really a pleasure to be back, although I'm back under a different hat in some way. And thank you for the kind, undeserved introduction. One thing I do agree with is that I've moved around a lot, both in terms of institutions and in terms of interests. But there's always been sort of a thread that has linked my various research projects as well as my institutional involvements. And an interest in knowledge production has always been there, and an interest in working as groups and collectivities on trying to change or at least further and promote certain types of knowledge production has always been there from the very beginning. So as I read the documentation of the project, striking from the margins, I really focused right away on the idea that this is an attempt to change our vocabularies and to change our conceptual frameworks and to find new ways of speaking about various issues. So this is why I thought it might be not too irrelevant to give a talk on social sciences in the Arab region, on gaps, elisions, and glosses, and I will discuss what I mean by each one of these words. They do not mean the same thing, or I do not intend to use them in the same way. But also towards the latter half of the talk, I will talk about some of my own research. An article I have written on Copts in Egypt, although this is not a primary research project, but I'll explain why I focused on the issue of Copts in Egypt. And then at the very end, give a few examples from my work on Circassians and other North Caucasian peoples, both in their presence in the Middle East, Turkey and Jordan primarily, as well as in the North Caucasus, in the homeland. So I hope that will make things more concrete and the gaps and elisions and glosses more apparent, in that how in my work I have struggled with the fact that there wasn't a language, there wasn't a framework to capture the kinds of processes that I was trying to deal with, or at least that's my explanation for my work. You may agree or disagree, but also finally that in a way I have always been working on and in margins, and this has been a very conscious sort of part of my understanding of where I've been, my position, whether it's in trying to establish a department of anthropology in Jordan, a discipline that did not exist in the universities before that, or in terms of the research I did on small groups, so-called minority groups and so on. So the issue of margins has always been very important and central to my work. I will start with the issue of the social sciences in the Arab region, and with the ACSS, the Arab Council for Social Sciences, which, as you may know, has a project now called the Arab Social Science Monitor, which attempts to document and evaluate and advocate for the social sciences in the region. This is the kind of project that, you know, includes building databases and gathering information that doesn't exist and persuading people to give you information they don't want to give you and so on. So it's not the most sort of exciting of work in terms of the process, but the products are actually quite remarkable and quite exciting, and shows how what we lack in the region in terms of this kind of documentation and so on, which in many other places, although not in all places, we take for granted that this kind of information is collected by national bodies or by universities themselves or by research councils and so on. There's very little of this kind of documentation of the social sciences or any discipline or of higher education in the region. So any statement about the state of social sciences, which usually I and my colleagues are all guilty of making those kinds of statements. In fact, those statements are usually based on our personal experience, on our knowledge of a few institutions, and not really based on evidence. And so it was very important for the institution itself, for the Arab Council itself, to know the terrain that we were working in. And so trying to document higher education, document the place of social sciences, used very broadly, I mean, social and human sciences really within higher educational systems was very important. We don't aim to become a panopticon of, you know, sort of seeing everything that is out there, but we do hope that we can organize our own work, the grants we give, the conferences we have, the training workshops we do and so on, organize them based on a little more information and knowledge of what is out there and what is needed, as well as in order to think about knowledge production itself and what are the infrastructures that are needed to produce knowledge on a field, on a discipline, on a phenomenon, on anything out in the world that we're interested in. So this is sort of the introduction and explaining how I think it is relevant to your project to talk about the social sciences in the Arab region. So the Arab Social Science Monitor produced its first report in 2012. I have a few copies if the library here would like some. Authored by Professor Mohammed Bami, a sociologist at Pittsburgh, but also a member of our board of trustees. And it's titled Social Sciences in the Arab World, Forms of Presence. And what he tries to do in this report is to look both at academic infrastructures in terms of universities and research centers in the region, but also looking at the public sphere. Are the social sciences present in media, in newspapers, in magazines, in other ways in which knowledge and information circulates in the region outside academia proper? And there are a few surprises in this report, and which we did not expect, and which really need more thinking and more reflection, as well as more documentation. So, simplistic reduction of all the problems of the weaknesses of research and teaching in the social sciences in the region. A simplistic reduction focuses either on a lack of resources or on authoritarian regimes and censorship, including self-censorship. Although these are, in fact, powerful factors that shape knowledge production, there are other issues that also come into play. One of the things that I would just mention, what I think are 4 or 5 main issues relevant to this conversation from this report. The first piece of information that was interesting for us was to see the huge growth, in fact, since the 1990s in universities and research centers. We did not expect to see such a growth, institutional growth. This is leaving aside issues of quality and other things like that. And so the first point to make is that Arab universities are very young in the region. 70% of the universities were formed after 1991. And so they were formed in the conditions prevailing after 1991, including a view of education as being primarily for training for the job market, a view of the university quite different from the idea of the national public university of the past, and so on. So 70% of universities come after 1991. The social sciences at a faculty level, it may appear as a minor or as a course here and there, but at a faculty level and department level exists in only 48%. Now, some people say it exists in 48%. Some people say only in 48%. So that's whether you see the cup half full or half empty. I happen to think only in 48%, which because it's also only in the older universities that you really find the social sciences at a department level and even less at a PhD level. And so, you know, when we talk about the problems of knowledge production in the region and why is the region not producing its own frameworks and its own vocabularies and so on, really the first point is to say, well, how many people are engaged in this enterprise and how many institutions are there engaged in the enterprise of researching society and understanding society. Another point concerning infrastructures is when you look at the distribution of social science disciplines in universities, we find in the ones that do contain social sciences, we find economics first, and then quite a bit lower, we have sociology and psychology, about equal, and then comes political science, even less, history, even less, and then anthropology, simply because it's my discipline, so only 2% of these faculties. And so the image that you, or the understanding you get from this, as Vanya points out, is that the university considers modernity and modernization as its main function, that it engages or it invests in those disciplines that are most related to ideas, to issues of modernization and development. Issues that, this is whether this is a correct representation of these disciplines or not, leaving that aside, but issues of history, anthropology, of culture, and so on are relegated to sort of a second lesser interest, which, as Vanya points out, is surprising in societies where questions of heritage and historical legacies continually are discussed and seem to have deep social, political, and cultural impact. So the university as an institution is not a university that is able to comment on a wide variety of issues that society is in fact interested in. The other aspect that Bamia discusses is what he calls the weak academic memory prevailing in Arab universities and in particular disciplines. So that disciplines are not seen as building upon legacies of past generations, that there is a kind of disjunctures in knowledge, in the way in which disciplines are taught, and the way the history of these disciplines are taught, and there's no sense of continuity or genealogy in the writing or teaching of the social sciences. he highlights that new generations of social scientists seem to know little about important figures who founded their disciplines. And so instead we find this fragmentation of knowledge systems in the region. Bami attributes this to several reasons. One is poor networking and the absence of scholarly associations. But also, he says, a general phenomenon, and we can debate this, of a lack of connection between modern Arab societies and what he calls their formative heritage. So he says this is not unlike the way we talk about our societies anyway. It's not particular to disciplines or to academic knowledge. He says there has been a replacement of an organic relationship to the past with a rhetorical relationship to the past. So I think these are interesting ideas to discuss. The issue of language, which all of you know about, the fact that knowledge is produced, social science knowledge in different languages in the region, and of course French, English, and Arabic are not just languages, they're also systems of academic knowledge making, and so you find people who write in French don't quote people who write in English, even though they may know the language. This is not a matter of knowing the language, it's a matter of within which frame you are framing your work. And so you have this kind of linguistic fragmentation, which is more than simply linguistic. But also, he points out that the institutional boom in the creation of new universities and new institutions and the growth in one area, namely the countries of the Arab Gulf, leads to the evacuation of other areas. So faculty migrate to the Gulf, the sort of energies and projects which might have been built in one place are left behind, and people move elsewhere. So there's a mobility, there's high mobility in the region. So these are some of the issues beyond simply censorship or authoritarianism and so on, not to minimize the importance of that as well. In the report, I'll go over this very quickly. Bami deals with the themes and topics of the social sciences, especially in the media and in the public sphere. And I took a look at those tables and so on with your project in mind. And it's interesting that Islam appears to be mainly dealt with in terms of political Islam and Islamist movements. This is not a surprise, but should be noted that Islam is not dealt with in other terms, except in terms of, and this is looking at academic periodicals as well as cultural magazines, as well as TV programs and so on. So across the spectrum of the different types of media. And other than in newspapers, where Islam does appear high up in terms of the topics that are dealt with, in general, Islam appears on sort of 5th, 6th, 7th topic in terms of incidents. So we had people kind of go through magazines, go through newspapers, kind of recording what the themes were in these different outlets, and Islam appears somewhere in the middle of the list. Okay, so not high up at all, which again is sort of surprising. So this raises the question of where a general reading public or viewing public is receiving its ideas about Islam, and who is formulating, or from where the sort of formulation of these of ideas about Islam come from. This in the reading list, I put the volume by Hanafi and Arvanitis on knowledge production. I'm not going to go into the volume; it's very big for one thing, but to point out that they deal with some of the same questions, especially the issue of a scientific community, and is there a scientific community or communities of scholars in the region, and they use various methodologies, which I think are interesting for anyone interested in knowledge production. And I mentioned the one where they look at bibliometrics and they look at politics of citation, who cites whom in the Arab region, and generally show that Arab scholars very rarely cite each other. So yet another sort of bit of empirical evidence. But this brings us to a point where I can comment on all of these authors, on Bami and Hanafi and Arvanitis, and that their own memory seems to go back only to the post-independence state. So they start in the 50s, without feeling they have to explain why they're starting in the 60s. Of course, the 50s. Of course, the 50s are very important. Of course, independence is very important. Of course, there's a period that sees the creation of all sorts of national institutions, for knowledge production, for ideological product, for all sorts of things, political parties, etc. But I think it needs still a word of explanation that why do we start there? Why is that our baseline? And so, a history which I cannot go into and which there's very little writing on, and I would really love to see ACSS do more work on this kind of historical genealogies of knowledge. But one, I think, excellent example is the book by Omnia Shakri called The Great Social Laboratory, Subjects of Knowledge in Colonial and Post-Colonial Egypt. A very dense book in which she looks in great detail at the kinds of societies, as they were called at that time, associations, university departments, and so on, that were created in Egypt in the late 19th, starting in the mid-19th century, late 19th century. The book goes up to the 1952 revolution. And the book shows clearly how colonial and nationalist / post-colonial intellectual projects were intertwined and mutually constitutive. That although one could say these knowledge-producing institutions and endeavors and so on are being created in colonial times, and you could tar them with like they're all colonial enterprises, I think her careful research shows how they were not simply colonial projects, that Egyptians and non-Egyptians were involved together in creating these journals, these associations and societies. Expeditionary, I mean, to me it was a surprise, big expeditions to Sudan and Sinai to collect data and so on. And the Royal Geographic Society of Egypt formed in 1875, and in dialogue with ideas circulating in Europe at the time, and not at all in a sort of dependent or hierarchical way. And so she shows very carefully how the idea of race was debated in Egypt and how it was seen, how they were in fact talking back at the literature that was being produced in Europe. At the same time, or this is not to diminish the fact that this knowledge production was a proto-nationalist, eventually a nationalist one. This is not to say somehow they were doing better work or more objective work or whatever, but the fact that they didn't just receive concepts, but they were rethinking these concepts, especially of race and of nation, is, I think, extremely interesting, and of place, of history, were being debated and defined by scholars at the time, both Egyptian and non-Egyptian, but working in Egypt. And she talks about the university, what became Cairo University, how the departments were formed in the university, and how important these were to nationalist struggles. While at the same time, what has been more studied is the role of these kinds of discipline sciences in service of colonialism, which has been studied much more than their role in sort of anti-colonial struggles as well. So she talks about the whole idea of how they dealt with colonial difference, how they were talking about an Arab social science early on, and so on. The point to make is when we read something like our own report or Sari Hanafi's work, is why do we not go back further and understand how those legacies were squandered, deployed differently, buried, erased, etc. So talking about sort of losses and elisions and gaps and so on. There's a big gap in our own knowledge of what used to be produced in the region and what disappeared and why and when and how. Perhaps because North Africa sort of decolonized later, there's a bit more work on that and on the sort of the way in which post-independence social science talked back at colonial science. And so there's a well-known article by Tahir bin Jaloun, a Moroccan novelist, but also psychologist, written in 1974 on the critical function of sociology in the Maghreb, which I might sort of skip over in the interest of time. But what's interesting in both Shakri's work and Tahir bin Jaloun's article is the slippery blurring of distinctions between disciplines, which in a way is partly, 19th century and before disciplines became professionalized in a way as sociology or anthropology or economics, etc. But in Tahir Ben-Jelloun's piece, it's really like in the very same sentence, he says ethnography, sociology, anthropology meaning the same thing in a way. And then in other places, he distinguishes between them, but puts a kind of hierarchy. So ethnography is at the bottom, the worst of the sciences, and sociology is at the top as the best of the sciences. So it's interesting because we're living now at a time in the region where disciplines are so bounded and where people make such strong arguments that sociology is not anthropology and anthropology is not this and so on, which I find very unhelpful actually in terms of knowledge production. But it's quite interesting to see that in spite of the fact that the institutionalization of these disciplines are quite recent as disciplines, in the university they are strongly defended and so on. So Tahir Ben-Jelloun's main point is to say that the same principles on which we reject the colonial legacy, the fact that this research, whatever, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, did not have a critical function, it had a function of serving the state. We should use the same critique for the post-independence studies as well, that they also became in service of the state instead of having a critical function. And I think this is important. And so he says sociology was part of the colonial strategy of penetration and pacification. It was organized to be useful and to be applied. Then it goes on to say that the post-independence sociologists did the same thing. And so when we look at, say, the 70s in the region, we see that really development, modernization, that's the rubric, that's the framework in which all research is done or justified, and anything outside that rubric is not seen, is marginalized, in fact. So the simple point I'm trying to make is let's look at the historical legacies and let's look at the historical genealogies for where our ideas come from. And when I talk about the piece I wrote on Copts in Egypt, this was sort of what I was interested in. I was interested in how the word minority in Egypt, not elsewhere, but in Egypt, becomes associated with Copts and Copts only. You don't talk about any other group as a minority except Copts. Why is that? And also it's rejected on the basis of that Copts are not a minority. And then the concept itself is also rejected. So, I mean, I don't claim that in my article I go through this historical legacy, but at least I sort of gesture that we need to understand where this word minority comes from. What word is it displacing? What word is it replacing? And so on. The second point I think I've made is about disciplines and their meanings. And Ben-Jelloun's work really shows that art, in a small article as it is, shows how many institutions were set up, closed down, reopened, closed down again, etc. So there's a lot of institutional instability, which goes with the instability of meanings and instability of knowledge being produced. Another small point that I really, just take a look at the time, I don't want to spend time on, is that the other sort of issue which we don't deal with as well as we should is that we're usually working within the national framework in assessing the state of knowledge. So whether it's Bamia, whether it's Hanafi, whether it's the other people who've written on the issues of the problems of sociology or anthropology in Sudan, etc. These articles are always written with the national frame, and this national frame is extremely important, of course, but it's not the only way in which knowledge is produced. The transnational component of knowledge production, which has always been there, which shows up in Shakri's work in a way, because people and ideas are coming from Europe and elsewhere and so on, sort of gets neglected. And at the same time, we sort of view, when we say the weaknesses of social sciences in the Arab region, Bamia mentions this, we always talk about it in terms of a global social science that's out there that we are not part of. And the fact that we are part and parcel of some global circulation of ideas, even if we happen to be at the bottom of that, or we're not sort of at the center of it, or whatever, it's seen as this global local, the language of global and local, when at least applied to knowledge production, reproduces hierarchies rather than helps us understand why it is that scholars in the region may not be in these global circulations. Okay, so this is kind of the knowledge production part of the talk. And the idea of gaps is both in terms of understanding our own genealogies. There's huge gaps that we do not understand. The gaps may not in fact be there. There may be continuities, but we don't see them because we don't look at that kind of genealogical, we don't do that kind of genealogical work. The issue of elisions comes in both in what are the topics that are seen as proper topics for research and what are seen as outside important questions, and this is where state and nation building comes into it. And so I'll come to glosses because, and I'm speaking very fast, but I can talk much more about this. So at SSRC in my last 10 years there, we had this ongoing project which is just beginning to produce publications. So there's a book I co-edited with a colleague of mine, Cynthia Miller-Idris, on Middle East studies in the US, in US universities. And this is relevant here because in terms of this transnational aspect of all knowledge production, because I think one of the things we also don't understand well is how is knowledge produced on the region engaged with or not or ignored or talked back at by scholars in the region, and what is the role of Arab scholars who are outside the region in the circulation of ideas. And I don't have time to talk too much about this, but the first point to make is that when you look at Middle East studies in the US, it's an American enterprise. You have to understand it as an American enterprise and not universalize it into Middle East studies as it should be or as a universal kind of field. And what we try to do in this book that I just mentioned with Cynthia and a forthcoming book is look at how Middle East studies is located in the American universities within the ways in which the American universities studied the rest of the world. And this is a huge topic. The two books, the one that's come out, the one that's coming out early next year, only sort of touch the surface of these issues, but we have to look at sort of the place of the American university and why it produced the kind of knowledge it produced about other places and which places and in which ways and why area studies emerged as an American sort of enterprise. For this talk and for what we're talking about today, what's important is how does that impact what is studied, how it's studied in the region itself, and what are the connections or lack of connections. So I just throw that out there as something we need to think about, and I'm conscious that we're in Budapest, so that's a third location, and I'm sure an issue that you think about, not just in relation to the Arab region, but in general. Okay. Coming to what are the margins. So I want to, I imagine you've talked about this in this project, and I'm eager to hear how you've been talking about what is a margin and how is a margin produced. So I come specifically to the issues of identity, which is what I've worked on, ethnic identity. I know these are contested terms, and I hope I'll be clear about how I use them. And I think they have a lot of bearing on the study of religion in the region, although my own research has not focused on religion or religious identity in a direct way. In 1979, Janice Perlman, an urban sociologist, wrote a book called The Myth of Marginality, which looked at urban poverty and politics in Rio de Janeiro. So very far from the sorts of issues we're dealing with here, but I think the argument she made against using the word marginality applies. She argued that marginality, in the case of urban favelas, slum areas and so on was a myth, because when you studied those areas, you found them to be economically active, politically lively, culturally robust areas. They were not marginal to the city in any way. In a similar way, a lot of research on the urban informal sector in Latin America argued that what's labeled as informal is very much part and parcel of the economy of these areas. And so the words marginal area, informal economy, etc., is a process of producing marginality in scholarship as well as in the public discourse. And so these earlier works that argued against the labeling of peoples and places and so on as marginal, I think are relevant to our, at least they serve as a metaphor to our interest here, which is not to take marginality and margins as given and known entities, and to look at them as historically constructed, as politically produced, and as seen differently depending on where in this topography you stand. So margins are produced, even manufactured, through particular political, economic, and cultural processes and policies of powerful actors, none more powerful, especially till the recent past, none more powerful than the state at the height of the modernization era. The push and pull between center and margin and the ways in which they're intertwined and codependent should be our focus, as well as a realization that they can change places, which I know is one of the ideas of your project, and that the topography of centrality or marginality depends on where you stand and where you look from. This is not a relativism argument. I'm not that sort of anthropologist. It's an argument about political economy, it's an argument about political power, it's an argument about history, and so on. Now, the word minority is a particular kind of marginality and a particular kind of marginalization. The word minority, I argue, is a product of the nation state. Even if historians talk about minorities in the Ottoman Empire, this is an anachronistic use of the term. Okay? In the Ottoman Empire, except what Nadia will know better, except perhaps in the last years, the word minority was not the word that was used. Millet, ta'ifa, etc., different words to refer to different types of communities, but not minority. So here comes the article on Copts in Egypt, which is in this book called Words in Motion, edited by Carol Gluck and Anat Singh, and coming out of an SSRC project, which I directed with a colleague, Eti Abraham, on how words travel, and trying in this project not to look at intellectual genealogies in the classical sense of looking how different intellectuals wrote about this particular idea, that long German word, which I cannot pronounce. And also not even in the way Raymond Williams wrote in keywords, because in keywords there's one meaning to the phrase or topic or term or concept. And what we were trying to do in this project is to show the multiple meanings in which a word acquires, discards as it travels. And we were interested in how the word travels, not just from north to south, south to south, south to north. I mean, just think nowadays about all the words like Islam and jihad and hijab and burqa and so on as they travel north, sort of what they acquire, and how much of our energy is spent in saying that's not what the term really means, and things like that. So that was the project, and I was interested always in the word minority and the rejection of the word aqaliyya by most Arab intellectuals, almost all, with the exception of a few Sudanese, which is interesting in itself. Rejection by nationalists, rejection by Islamists, rejection by sort of whatever your particular framework might be. The word minority was seen as a foreign penetration, a foreign word, not applicable, and linked to foreign intervention and to the meddling in internal affairs and the root of much of the crises in these countries. And I completely agree with all of that. But I want to also understand how is the word minority being used? And what meanings does it acquire, even if it's being rejected or even if I agree with the fact that it should be rejected. And the basis of my agreeing on rejecting the word or understanding it is because it's firmly tied to the concept of nation state. And we need to sort of emphasize this. It seems like a very simple point, but I haven't seen it written sort of anywhere that I looked. And so once you label a group as a minority, it's as though they've been a minority since, an age-old minority. And you know the writings on the region that talk about age-old enmities between communities and so on, as though the groups themselves, the communities themselves you're referring to, have not undergone any change in their concepts of identity and so on. They've always been minorities, they will always be minorities. A sort of exception to this discourse, not really an exception, sort of the genesis of some of this discourse is in the idea of the Middle East as a mosaic. So, I mean, the innovation in the mosaic is that it's all minorities, there is no majority, which is another problem of its own. But the literature which talks about a majority and minorities as sort of eternally constituted is equally problematic, I think. And so one of the things I was interested in, and so even though I don't work on Egypt and I don't really work on Copts, and I felt very much as an interloper when writing this article, is because I wanted to understand minority not just in a certain place. I could have looked at Circassians in Jordan, which is what I knew best, but because I'm also very aware of the circulation within the Arab region of discourses, and I felt Egypt is one of these centers that produces sort of discourses that then get circulated. And so the way Circassians or non-Circassians talk about Circassians in Jordan is often in very similar terms that Egyptians talk about Copts. And so this is not an accident or because this is the reality, it's because these discourses travel and the way you talk about minorities travels. And one of the points that people constantly make when saying, when rejecting the word minority is saying that these people, X, have participated fully in the history of this country and in the making of this nation. And I think that's a powerful argument. And that's an argument against, that has the possibility of not marginalizing, of not saying certain peoples were outside history and so on, but bringing them into history. I think that's actually a positive way of thinking about the diversity of groups in any society. The negativity comes when you deny people rights based on that same argument. They are like everyone else, therefore they don't need churches or they don't need schools or they shouldn't be allowed to teach their language. I mean, when the same argument is used to deny rights, that's where the problem is. So looking at the Copts in Egypt, what does this example do, or how does it help us? How did it help me understand things better? First of all, trying to trace the word minority in Egypt and when does it first appear, shows it to be firmly a modern word. It appears for the first time, as far as I could see, in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, the words are ta'ifa, and all the various words, millah to some extent, ummah, etc. All the words that come from Islam, but from states and empires that are using, that are shaping a kind of Islamic vocabulary for their peoples. And so it's a very modern word. It doesn't come with colonialism or interpenetration of the West or anything like that. So that's an interesting point. It comes in Egypt, as far as I could tell. The first time it's used in the press is in the 1920s when Egypt is debating a new constitution. So they're debating a new constitution and they're debating whether there should be quotas and certain seats for certain groups, namely the Copts. And that's where the word minority and the word majority appears in the press, at least for the first time. So what in this article I try to show is how the concept of minority changes or gets shaped or formed in the long transition from empire to nation in Egypt. It changes from being a reference or it changes reference from being about the protection of minorities in the context of empire to the place of minorities in the national political community, in the sort of state-nation building era, to currently to becoming part of the discourse on international human rights. So the sort of, not the context, but the discursive framing of the word changes. In terms of the Copts, it's remarkably consistent in what it refers to. The building of churches, schools, the right to take Sunday off as a day off from work, and you know, so the demands are the same, but the frames are changing. So, Aqaliyya displaces Ta'ifa, which we can translate as sect, but they remain intertwined, and the meanings of Ta'ifa inflect Aqaliyya. This is, you know, I don't show this in the space of one article, but this is sort of my interest in looking at this word. The other place I looked, sorry, am I running out of time? I'm almost done. Yeah. The other place I looked at for minority was censuses. So I was being very much Benedict Anderson. I was looking at the census and the paper, and, you know, the museum and places like that. And the censuses were very interesting because in the censuses from 1848 to 1986, I looked at the reports, not the censuses themselves, but the reports produced by the censuses. The category of minority is never there. But whereas you start in 1882, which is seen as the first modern census because it shifted from the household to the individual as the unit of counting or the unit of enumeration. In 1982, you only have sedentary Egyptians, Egyptian Bedouins, and foreigners. Those are the three categories. And gradually, it becomes sort of almost, you know, psychotically detailed in terms of the different groups, so that by like 1917, you have nationality and race and community and cult, and I don't know how many sort of categories in which the Egyptian people residing in Egypt get divided. And then in the first census after the revolution, all this is dropped, and you only have Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and then you have workers, students, and peasants, sort of replacing this incredible diversity, which in the late 19th and early 20th century marks the censuses. So it's really fascinating. And you have things in the report, like in 1917, quote, in the case of Copts, notwithstanding the theoretical objection that the word Copt does not designate a special race or religion, it should be entered in the race column because it embraces a definite community. I mean, a really sloppy sentence there. You know, they're not a race, but they should be enumerated as a race because they're a community. So, and what's interesting here is the foreigners, in a way, because as you know, in mid-19th century onwards, there was huge migrations from Europe, Hungarians, Austrians, Italians, Greeks, as well as Arabs from Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere, sort of moving into Egypt, which was booming. And so all of these people are labeled as foreigners in these censuses. So there's Egyptian and foreigner. And in a way, this is why in 1952 or in 1956, when you have an exodus of a lot of these groups, somehow the national fabric is discursively not shaken by the exodus of all of these people. People's memories and the way they think of their cities, etc., is shaken, but officially they were foreigners from the very beginning. And so you don't need to account, or you don't need to sort of talk about how this happens. Okay. So what the article on Copts sort of helps me understand is how inclusion and exclusion is labeled, how in the Copts, and I chose Copts rather than because they are recognized by everyone as being central, as being very much part, as being, you know, part of the body fabric, the original Egyptian, etc. And even so, with a situation like that, the kind of damage the word aqaliyya can do in debates and the reasons for rejecting aqaliyya. Rejecting aqaliyya, yes, as far as I'm concerned, but how do you deal with the actual social phenomenon if you don't have a word for it? Is the question I pose. And not just in terms of thoughts, but why are Nubians in Egypt not seen as a minority? We never talk about Nubians as a minority in Egypt. Or Sudanese, who've been there now for generations, are Jaliya. They're not an aqaliyya. Jaliya with the concept of exile, forever discursively in exile, the Sudanese in Egypt. So why do different words attach themselves to different communities, and what power does this have? Final, I'll do this very shortly. My work on Circassians has been mostly on Circassians in Jordan, Circassians in Turkey, and then after the fall of the Soviet Union, sort of the trips back to the homeland and rediscovering the homeland and the way in which the encounter with the homeland changes notions of identity and notions of history and notions of self. And in an attempt to link this to religion, in this article that I gave you for the bibliography, there are three life stories, very short life stories of three Circassians who travel either from Jordan or from Turkey back to the Caucasus. This research is from 1993. So this is very soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in terms of Islamic movements and so on, very early days. And so the three life stories, one is of sort of a man in his 40s going from Turkey trying to establish business, import-export business in the Caucasus, and how he thinks of this as part of his identity and his return to the homeland. A second case study of a woman in her 40s, unmarried woman, goes back to the Caucasus for nationalist reasons, because we should go back to the homeland and build up a state and become a proper people. And so that kind of political frame in which she places her return. And the third case, which now is relevant in 2017 in a way which was not relevant in 1993, is the story of Omar from Jordan, who was 23 years old at that time, who became religious working on the railway in Jordan, which in itself is, there's one track, right, and one train that goes once a week, but that was his job, to work on the railway, and he discovered Islam, not discovered it, he was Muslim, but became religious sort of together with other people who were working on the railway. He started to read about Afghanistan, he goes to fight in Afghanistan, he joins an organization that's funded by Saudi Arabia. All this, when I was listening to this in 1993, it was like, it was a fairy tale almost, but now we see it as the roots of something which has grown and become bigger. So he's in an organization funded by Saudi Arabia. He's very unhappy because they're very well funded. They get a lot of food, whereas the Bangladeshis who are fighting next to them don't get any food. So he's very aware of the inequalities of the situation he's in. He gains 25 kilos fighting in Afghanistan. And then he decides this is not the Islam he's looking for. He travels back to Jordan through Saudi Arabia. He discovers in Medina, this is how he discovers, etc. This is how he phrases it, that in Medina there are ulama who teach the real Islam, not the Islam of the state, so he wants to go study with them, but he's denied a visa by the Saudis. And so he decides to go to the Caucasus as a Circassian. He can get a Russian passport, and if he applies as a Russian for these schools, Saudi Arabia is going to give him a visa. So basically his whole return for the homeland has nothing to do with the homeland, at least the way he expresses it at that time. It's about his search for true Islam, but his search for true Islam is blocked by visas and borders and so on. So he transforms himself from an Arab to a Russian in order to go and study Islam. So the story is there, the way he tells it. And as I say in the article, a few months later, so he discovers the only way to get a Russian passport is to marry a Russian citizen woman. So he marries a Circassian, or he's waiting when I meet him to marry. In the meantime, he has started drinking because there's so much alcohol around, and he lost 25 kilos. And, he's so, through his body, he is sort of transforming himself and his identity and his relationship to Islam and to religion. So he comes across as just a confused young man who's searching for something he doesn't know what, and probably that's what it is. But as we know, ISIS is populated by these kinds of young people, men and women. A few months later, in Jordan, a friend of his I ran into a friend of his, and he said, "Oh, you remember our friend Omar? He got killed in Chechnya fighting with the Chechens against the Russians. You know, a cause he didn't really identify with, in the name of a kind of Islamic Chechenian nationalism, which he didn't identify with, and so on." So I end with this, showing how, in the case of Omar, the relationship to Circassians being Muslim and to his Islamic identity cannot make sense. You have to kind of see the unfolding of this relationship through his life story. Now, how do we generalize from this? This is the eternal problem of anthropologists. But at least through these kinds of life stories and narratives of individuals, we can make more complex sort of the idea that Islamic identity is something permanent in people and, drive them in certain directions and so on. So the last point I want to make is I wrote a dissertation on Circassians in Jordan in 1982 in UC Berkeley, and the word Islam appears, I think, twice in the whole dissertation. And I look back on it now and I say, how could I have done that? How could I have written a whole dissertation on Muslim people without mentioning Islam? And so this is my final point about how our frames themselves change. If I use that data again, I'll probably go back looking for Islam in my field notes in a way that I didn't see before. This is not to say that Circassians in Jordan have not changed. They've completely, in the past, since I did that field work in the past, whatever, I hate to think about it, 40 years or whatever it's been, their relationship to Islam has changed. Individuals have developed differing relationships to Islam. But the fact is that that even though there are people who, here I'm glossing over and assuming you know a little bit of this history of the expulsion of peoples from the North Caucasus into the Ottoman Empire by the Russian Empire in the late 18th century and so on, they came in the name of Islam. And this was something very important in their narratives, that we didn't stay there. I don't think this is actually empirically true, but for whatever reasons they felt they had to leave or they were expelled. The narrative is one of coming to the land of Islam, of coming to the Ottoman because we were Muslims and so on. So in spite of it being a kind of foundational narrative of Circassianness in Jordan, it clearly in my interviews and clearly in my observations and so on, this Islamic identity was not being verbalized, discussed, negotiated, and so on. But today, if you sit in any sort of Muslim household, in any Circassian household in Jordan, the issue of Islam is going to come up all the time, not only because of the context and the politics, or because of the context and the politics. Young women are veiling in increasing numbers. Most of them are wearing headscarves. In the Caucasus, young women are veiling rapidly. Young men are going to fight here and there and everywhere in the name of Islam. And, for example, parliamentary representatives of Circassians, they have a quota in the Jordanian parliament, whereas in the first election that was held in the 90s, the first election since 1967 that was held for parliament, the two Circassian representatives one was a woman, Tujan Faisal, well known, liberal, I wouldn't call her a leftist, but she might call herself a leftist. And the second representative was Mansour Murad, who was a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and famously hijacked one of their airplanes in 1978 to the Jordanian desert, of 79, whatever. Those were the representatives of the Circassian community in parliament. Today, both representatives, or now it's increased to 5, I think, are all Muslim Brotherhood candidates. So, this kind of change over 30 years or 40 years is sort of what we have to understand, as opposed to they're a minority, they're Muslim, these are age-old somehow understandings of identity that they hold. So I hope this wasn't too fragmented in itself.
Thank you very much. Sit down next to you.
It was 1 hour after.
No, that was just perfect and really gives us a lot of not only food for thought but also now for discussion. So because what you did in your presentation is on the one hand what we want to do, right, is to say to what an extent do we have, the tension between the need to have stable concepts and to understand the structures with which you want to work, and to what an extent these stable concepts are inhibiting us of understanding what is really happening, and thus the need to not necessarily, and I think at least I heard this from the way you presented it, we don't need to constantly invent new vocabularies, but we need to see how we adjust vocabularies that had been maybe at a certain point salients, need to be either reactivated or reinterpreted in order to have the proper instruments to understand. And that is, I think, the second important point, these changes that we can trace in the individual, right? That is not because they were a minority, but there are obviously other forces. And that you end with biographical data or biographies is obviously also reflected in what we do in various, also in history now, we see this biographical turn, right? The biographical turn, because we do see a need here that we need to readjust through the witness of individuals, but individuals that then form groups, right, where we can move from personal testimony and change within a lifetime into an understanding of how social change, cultural change really occurs. And to that tension that you described, that sociologists, anthropologists in particular, have also from the text that you write based on individual biographical testimony to understanding what I'm in love with Durkheim, so with the fundamentals of how societies really are structured and work, that is a stretch, right? And I think with the project we are also in this stretch. So on the one hand, to look at what you call for this presentation, to really look at the diversity and specificity of individual cases, and this is we're doing in a small scale, Iraq and Syria, and at the same time to develop from there some general observations that seem to be specific to that we think are specific to the region at large, and then connected in various ways to other social, political, religious, cultural phenomena to which we want to connect this. And so this requires indeed, this is why it was very helpful to hear. I must admit, although you gave us a list, I didn't look at Mohammed's report, Bamia's report. So it is indeed very relevant to see that we do have now a monitor, you call it, right? A monitor of what is happening in the social sciences, what we, I think, indeed really need, because what you also described, I think, very well, is that we have parallel systems of scholarship. We didn't speak now about the US scholarship, but I know for myself, I often say, no, I'm not going to MESA, this is too American for me. We as European scholars, we often don't find a way, it's a completely different world. Mm-hmm. And what we do has nothing to do with our American scholars do, even if we work on the same topic. So we go there for anthropological reasons very often to see how do these US scholars work, how do the Americans work on the Middle East, because we do it very differently. So there's obviously a lot of these various languages. So I think but of course the very notion of the margins is one that we're only starting internally with the group to discuss, and that is something which will will have to be very procedural, right? I hope that at the end of this this project we'll be in a position to formulate something which, as you also showed, is not really yet or may never be a theory on marginality, because it is so much linked to specific cases and to the very historicity of these cases. And nevertheless, I think we can discern, at least we all have that feeling, right, from the various work that we do, that this is a way to understand what is happening, so that it must have heuristic capacities, right, but which we have not translated into any serious theoretical concept. And if we get closer to this after 2 years, that would be great. But I shouldn't occupy now the floor with just because I sit here. Central, I give it now to the margins, the periphery, to the audience to comment to what we have heard. Please, the floor is open. Comments, questions, reflections upon what you have heard. Who likes to jump in? Nobody?
There's nobody. Maybe I can just add just a couple of things to what you said. Thank you very much indeed, Seteney. This is really immensely suggestive and very encouraging, particularly for us, given the way in which we have been working on designing the project and the way in which the internal dynamic actually is growing. And I particularly, I think the way in which you revisited your doctoral thesis of 1982 is quite poignant. In fact, if one were to look at a textbook of the social sciences of that time and look at the index, one will not find religion, one will not find culture. Virtually absent. Virtually absent. So there is actually a whole tradition of tried and tested concepts and methods in the social sciences which have also been subjected to the sort of elision that you're talking about. This break in institutional memory and in scientific memory, as it were. This applies not only to scholarship produced in the Arab world, it applies also to scholarship produced. If we were to take a topography, if we were to construct a topography with weighted notions of space, then we would say that this is probably more advanced as a process in the United States than it is in Europe. This particular edition of the memory of certain notions in the social sciences. Nadia mentioned Durkheim, but there's of course quite a band of notions which I think would be enriched by the critiques that have been performed in the last 30 years. Without these critiques, in my view, then necessarily leading to the conclusion that these are notions that are no longer operative, right? So this is really where we are, and this is where I find it, where I found your presentation particularly suggestive. The way in which certain words, certain terms, certain key terms, we've constructed a kind of sociolinguistic lexical pragmatics, as it were, to give it a technical sense, which I think is extremely useful in these circumstances, because these words are circulated. I personally have a great degree of reserve towards using the term identity, because it's going to be received in a variety of different ways in any audience to which I might present it. But to go back to the question of minority, and particularly to the idea of the connection of minority to the nation state, of course, it is connected to the construction of the nation state, but it's also connected to the destruction of the nation state. If you were to see how the Iraqi state, at one point in time, came to be described as a Sunni minority lording it over a Shia majority, for instance. Again, this is an instrument, if we're talking of the political economy, an instrument in actually dismantling a nation state. Whatever, whatever one might think of that particular regime or of that particular government.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, thank you very, very much, Nira. There's quite a lot of material that we will be able to exchange usefully, and indeed the idea of marginality. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I have no questions.
Yes, please have.
Thank you very much. It was really impressive. So first, to follow up on what Aziz just said, because I did some research about nation building, the concept of nation building in Iraq, and I noticed also this change of paradigm from the homogenizing integrationist discourse of nation building into consociationalist discourse after 2003, in which those cultural identities have become more salient in the political discourse and also as frames of representation. So I think also it's important to see historically how those paradigms have changed and what are the causes of the change in those paradigms, especially in relation to the global context where we moved from the polarizations of the Cold War into post-Cold War paradigms of identity politics and cultural politics that are very dominant in the American discourse. I wanted to ask you a question about your experience in the Arab Council for Social Sciences, particularly on an issue that you touched upon, but I hope that you could speak in greater detail about it, which is independence. We know that we are talking about a region that is very polarized, very ideologically and culturally charged with conflicts, especially this identity perspectives. We were together in the last conference, and one of the questions that we received in our session is that why you are trying to use the tools of the Western social sciences to understand our Arab realities, and we are very well acquainted with discourses about Islamic sociology, for example. So how do you see your project in this debate, and also with regard to, you know, that when it comes to types of association like yours, the question of funding is important. And here I wanted to also relate it to the question of discontinuities in the region, because the continuous change of political and economic paradigms in the region probably was one reason why there is also those discontinuities in the social sciences. So if you are aspiring to have a project that's sustainable, what are the sources of funding that could secure its continuity for a long time without compromising your independence as an association?
So there's a number of questions, right? You want to respond?
Sure.
Yeah.
No. Wonderful sort of points and questions. I'm glad that somehow I managed to convey my interest in always linking ideas and concepts and research to some kind of infrastructure, that we can't think of them separately. So this was the kind of a bit of a break in the talk, but where I find it very important, like from what kind of infrastructure are our ideas and our concepts and so on arising. And so the issue of what to call things and what to call people, and whether to use the word identity or not, or the way we abandon words because rightfully or rightly so, because they take on a meaning or they suggest a research agenda we don't agree with, and so we don't want to use that word, but what word do we use instead? And this is where I find what concept, of course, not word, but what concept do we use instead? And this is where I find myself constantly at a loss, and where the Arabic literature doesn't give me an alternative, and the literature in English or French and so on also doesn't give me a vocabulary to use to explain something, to discuss something like Circassians in Jordan and Omar and their relationship to themselves, to history, to their context, etc. And certainly Muslim doesn't help me at all in understanding this case. And so we're left without words. I mean, this is, this is the tragedy, really, rather than somehow authoritarianism or censorship or whatever, that we have no words to talk about these realities. And so what happens is people write and say, Circassians are this, Circassians are that, Kurds are this, Shiites are that, but then you're not questioning, because you're not using a meta-concept, you're using a descriptive label, you're not questioning what is a Kurd, what is a Shiite, what is a Circassian, who is a Circassian, who is a Kurd, because you're not using a concept. And the French, or at least my encounters in France, have always pushed me in this, why are you saying minority, even though you kind of explain what you mean by it, or I don't actually use the minority, but or why are you saying ethnic identity? Why are you saying ethnicity? Because as you say, in the US it means one thing, in France they hear it in a different, they hear it closer to race, and so on. So there are objections to the terms through which I try to make the issue analytical and not a case of Marx, was it? Misplaced concreteness, like just saying Circassians, then in itself is a misplaced way of, because I'm not talking about every single person who may identify as a Circassian and how they are, and in one context they're Circassian, in another context they're not. So why am I labeling this person as Circassian when, when he joins the PFLP, he's a Palestinian resistance fighter, but I've called him a Circassian. In the way we get labeled, even as a Muslim scholar, has said this and that. So we need concepts. We need concepts. And on these sorts of issues, the concepts that we are dealt, the hand we're dealt with is not useful. And that has stopped me from publishing. I mean, not to blame my lack of publications on that only, but on all sorts of things. But I remember, this is a story very early and formative in my experience, but I had just finished my PhD. I was just teaching at Yarmouk. I got an invitation to attend a conference of the Arab Sociological Association, which at that time was like the most active and exciting sort of group of people. So I was very flattered. And I sent a, telegram or telex or something with my abstract, which was on Circassians in Jordan, because there was nothing else I could talk about in 1983 or whatever. And I got this reply saying, never mind that, why don't you talk about anthropology in Jordan instead? It was like anthropology was basically me and Martha Mundy. What was there to say? But that kind of silencing, right away, don't talk about Circassians in Jordan. Even though, the case of Circassians in Jordan is interesting for me within, ethnicity, identity, whatever, because they're not an underprivileged, oppressed minority at all. They're quite oppressed. They were quite elite until recently. And that's another story of what's happening recently. But, this is not a story of people who are oppressed, or that somehow shows the state it does, in my opinion, show the state in an unfavorable light, but not at first look, in a different way. So this kind of don't talk about things like this at the Arab Sociological Association. Although I owe them a big thank you, because, I tried to write this thing on anthropology in Jordan. And it was kind of the beginning of my trying to figure out knowledge production, actually, and why are we teaching anthropology in Jordan? What kind of anthropology? So in a way, they, it was helpful. But the other funny part of the story is they never sent me instructions on how to get to the conference. So I couldn't go because I kept saying I knew it was in Hammamat in Tunisia, but that's all I knew. And then afterwards they were like, where were you? Some people said, we waited for you. You never told me where to go. So clearly, if you don't know, you don't belong, right? If you somehow didn't know where to go, then you shouldn't be there.
Tahir Labib's organization.
It was Tahir Labib. And so, if you didn't know who to ask, then clearly you didn't belong there anyway in the first place. So, so this kind of, first encounter really with Arab academia, with a kind of transnational Arab academia and so on, was this for me. And so it has always been, I'm very confident of of my research, and that I have things to say, and that it's interesting and so on. But the only context in which you can talk about these things are things like Iraq and disintegration and fragmentation and so on. So the question I would pose about minority being a nation-state word, but also therefore, or I would say therefore destructive also, or destructive element is, why is the only option to talk about what's happening in Iraq why is it in terms of Kurds, Arabs, Sunnis, Shiites? You all must remember when suddenly Iraq became Kurds in the north and Shiites in the south, as though some Kurds weren't Shiite and as well some Shiites weren't Kurds. It became divided, the Sunni triangle and so on. This is geopolitics that's defining the terms for us. And then we are caught in the terms that have been defined for us, and we're trying to say, when you say Kurd, there's this and there's that, and it's not all the same thing, and so on. You're constantly in a defensive position. So I agree that minority is a dangerous word. It becomes a dangerous word only because it's invested with so much power that you don't talk about it until it forces itself on you by violence, and then you understand that violence through terms minority instead of
you understand it
through that word. You understand the violence through that word, then you're captured by it, and you can't sort of escape from it. And so I think I don't claim that I figured it out. How does it work when you just, instead of saying the Circassians, if I just say Circassians, I remove the definite article? Does that resolve the problem? It's really...
The worst actually is to use the definite article at the singular. The Circassians.
The Circassians, right? Yeah. The Circassians.
But on this note...
Which is actually not uncommon.
Yeah.
On this note, Seteney, so to connect this a little bit, then if we take then the example of Iraq, right, or we have then the Egyptian example. So what is always my question is, this is the Arab Council for Sociology, social sciences, so it's a research council. So if we think of the European Research Council, we make clear that European Research Council means, we don't mean that if I study a phenomenon in Sweden, I know what's happening in Portugal. But when we do this in the Arab world, as you also said, I look at, for example, Copts, and then I have some idea. And there, there is obviously, this is now extreme, but I do think we do have a big problem, no? That when we say European Research Council, it is clear that there is a will to define and to bring together collaborations from different nations in order to strengthen European scholarship. That is the only notion of European. Sometimes it can also be, it is about a Europeanness of, let's say, heritage, the critique of this new heritage studies. No, what is the purpose of doing heritage or museum studies? Yeah. Now, when we do this for the Arab Research Council, obviously, I wonder what you're thinking is in this. So somehow, because we have one language and not different languages, we say we have the dominant Islam, and that would be a unifying tool, but we also say, or history, but we also just said that doesn't really work. So how do you operate with this? So what you also mentioned in your advertisement for the talk, so that we deal with diversity, which is it's geographical, it's larger cultural units, right? North Africa has really nothing in common with, I don't know, Abu Dhabi, right? There is, what would we compare? But we would still put this into an Arab sociology or an Arab social science. So how do you deal with finding a common regional approach, maybe even some methodologies or research questions that you want to put, but also recognizing, because I think that is so very important, that we do say, Jordan is not Egypt, right? Yeah. We really do need to take into account what you were also saying. So how do you balance this?
I link this to the question about funding. And I say I don't have an answer, but we figure it out as we're doing it, which I think is by practice. There are certain ideas with which the ACSS started about independence and about trying to create a research space in the Arab region similar to the idea of a European research space. So on our website and so on, the Arab world slips through me every now and then, but usually I say Arab region because we're not making a claim about any kind of homogeneity or any kind of, and so on, which we're trying to use it as a geographical term. This is not to mean that we're neutral about it, okay? But the idea of the Arab research space, it's on the first page of our website. There's a map. You can't imagine how hard it was to take out the borders from these Google Maps and so on, like how much the technicians had to work to, and the borders kept reappearing somehow, you would like post it. So we have a map of the countries of the Arab League of States, which is kind of a cop-out, but that's what we say, member countries of the Arab League of Arab States, and it's all colored one color, and there's no borders. And we say this is a research space, and we're trying to encourage collaborations and circulations and mobility within this space. Not to the neglect of the North and South and all of that, but like this is our mission rather than an ethnic mission of, Arab social scientists. So also there's these convoluted, it's interesting because you can just say European, and it means anyone living in Europe, right? At least depending on the elections results and governments that are coming in place. But, Arab immediately sounds ethnic. So what about the Kurdish scholar who was in Erbil, University of Erbil? And so we have these convoluted sentences, which is a symbol of our problem and our struggle, that we say anyone who's a citizen or a resident without citizenship in one of the countries of the Arab League, or whose origins lives outside, but whose origins come back to one of the countries of the. So you can be a Turkmen living in Detroit, and you can be a member of the Arab Council because you show. And we're not asking for documents or DNA tests or whatever to prove that you have an origin. Anyone brave enough to say they're Arab or have a link to the Arab region deserves to be a member. But this is procedural, but it's also very important and meaningful. And all I can, in response to your question, and I'll come to the funding, it's about trying to create the conversations, the collaborations, the networkings. I think our conference, which you attended, does not have, there is no similar other forum in the region. Whatever its shortcomings or problems with the specific papers or with sessions or whatever, there is no forum that brings people together, especially younger scholars, together in the region in that way. And with all three languages, as you saw, officially we operate in the three languages. And this brings us into conversations with some people who are like, you're the Arab Council, everything should be in Arabic. So I'm happy to have a working group working in Kurdish, if that's meaningful, a meaningful research collaboration. We're not, the funding, of course, is, until now, so one point you made, which is important about funding, which is that the lack of continuity is partly due to the way funding comes into the region, because the flavor of the month, the flavor of the year, everyone's suddenly working on whatever it is, because all the funding is there. Refugees now, of course important, and of course refugee, there should be research on refugees and so on, but like now drop everything else, you only work on refugees. So the idea of independence here in a way is allowing through our programs for people to work on what they find interesting. And I think as an organization or a university or a research center or a state, you can have priorities of research. You can say A, B, and C are more important than E, F, and G. But I think as an individual scholar, you should never tell somebody that a topic is not important or a topic is not interesting. Or if it's interesting to them, it's interesting to them. If it's important to them, but will they get the funding? This is the limited meaning of autonomy that we mean here. All our funding is coming from Western organizations, primarily Swedish SIDA, Canadian IDRC, Ford Foundation, Carnegie, and Mellon Foundation. We have not tried very hard. Imagine if we had funding from Qatar now, which was a logical place to get funding from. Imagine if we had it, what would we do today? So, I mean, the problems of funding are very, very key. And all I can say is we're conscious of it, but, I mean, there's very little you can do to plan. You have to kind of hope that what you're creating has some continuity, even if this organization collapses in 5 years, that you've created something in universities, research networks, curriculum change, etc., that will have a continuity of its own. I mean, this is a lesson I had to learn after Yarmouk. You know, so everything we tried to do at Yarmouk collapsed after that brilliant generation. You know, there was no other. So how do I think about all the work I did? You know, how do I give it meaning? It's hard.
Yes.
But you have to think not in terms of. I mean, I hope 50 years from now ACSS is going. So I really hope so. But if it's not, you know, I hope some of the change it's trying to make and trying to affect will have things so that other things develop, whether they're, and I think they have to be institutionalized in one way or another. Just individuals running around trying to be creative doesn't work. But whether you have to go out of the region for a while, or you have to go to another country, or you have to be mobile, you know, Talal Asad says the state is always studied as static, but that the state's power lies in its mobility and its ability to be in the street and throw tear gas at you. You know, so this idea of mobility, I think, is very important. That you have to be mobile, you have to be experimental, continuously experimental. It's the only way I've seen it so far.
Yeah, this is the weapon of the weak, right, that we have to have, because in other contexts, if you just for closing, that would be precisely in a European context, you are punished and for your mobility, right, that there you have to be stable and you are there where your state is. Otherwise, you are very badly punished. We need to precisely develop a different logic. I think, because I don't see any hands up and our time is... sorry, you take another question?
Yeah, I'm
please.
fine. I'm happy. I can stay all day. Yeah.
Could I ask about the Arab region, social science, and the non-American or the non-Western political geography? And in particular, is China on your radar of social science in the region? So do you have emerging or existing partnerships with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences or universities?
Yeah, we're meeting with them in September, actually.
I'm very interested to learn more about that.
So it's interesting because someone just asked me about this yesterday. So from the beginning, in the planning of the ACSS, there was a decision to make it an Arab Council, and that was a particular decision, a particular discussion. But there was always sort of language in all the founding documents and so on about how this did not mean an inward-looking, sort of closed-off kind of enterprise. And so the idea of South-South academic collaboration, of course, has been around for a long time. There were programs, notably out of the Netherlands, like CEFIS, which particularly funded that kind of South-South workshops and fellowships and mobility and so on. But this is sort of, it's there, it's a particular interest of mine, in fact, personally, of collaborations cross-regional collaborations and so on. It's among the hardest things to actually do because, one, the funding doesn't come that way. The funding comes to do Arab region work, most of it. And also because we have conversations going on with Codesria, we have conversations going on with Claxo, they attend our conferences, we attend their conferences. It's always marginal, by the way. It's an add-on. You can't make it central to your work. The best way or our most successful, in a way, work, and Nadia was mentioning this, I was interested in this Asia connections, is there's a project at SSRC, which I had started, and part of my negotiation with the ACSS board was that I keep that project at SSRC and it becomes a joint project. So I keep a foot in. It's called InterAsia. And it has a conference every 2 years. It has a junior faculty fellowship, it has workshops, it has working groups and so on, and ACSS continues to be a partner in this Inter-Asia project, which is precisely about collaborations from Asia defined from east to west, okay, from Japan to Turkey. And the idea here, and this would be the topic of a completely other lecture, is what happens if you think of the Eastern Mediterranean as West Asia instead of Arab or Eastern Mediterranean or and so on. And what happens, so very briefly, I have a lot to say on that. Very briefly, it opens up new horizons and new ways of seeing your history and seeing historical connections that have been sundered by standard nationalist accounts, okay, which historians, of course, do that research of Arabs in Malaysia and Arabs in Indonesia and China and so on. And people who work on Ottoman history know better than me, work on Ottoman and Persian and, you know, Mughal and India and the kinds of connections that existed there. But sort of contemporary, anyone doing contemporary, you know, it's either Middle East, North Africa is our frame, or Arab, you know, an Arab region or Arab world becomes kind of the subversive frame through which to do the Middle East, because it's. But if you think of Inter-Asia not as a matter of a bigger Asia, you know, bigger and better Asia, but as a set of connections, historical and contemporary, this is extremely timely because China is everywhere. But how do you know a single Arab scholar who's working on China? I've been looking. There's one guy in Lebanon, you know him, I'm sure, Masoud Daher, I think. But yeah, but yani, you know, there's no scholarship.
Well, no, but there had been, I mean, Mona Abaza was the first in the 90s to work on Indonesia and the Arab world. I mean, there have been individual scholarship that was...
Not too many.
Not too many, and also not so much so there it was then about... no, actually, in her work, it's both the discourses and the network of the merchants,
the education,
right?
And
yes,
the education.
And the exactly these ones. But that is true. There's very little.
Very little, and it's hard to interest people. And so, you know, we're going to do a workshop, hopefully this fall, because people have been applying who are in the region, have been applying to the Inter-Asia fellowships and so on, and some mostly are not getting the fellowships because their work is not actually Inter-Asian, but it's good work, and so we will try to bring people together in a workshop. And CAS, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is coming to Beirut in September, so we'll meet with them. Again, infrastructures, you know, the International Social Science Council, they don't do much, frankly, don't quote me, but, you know, at least it becomes a place where you meet. You meet CAS, you meet Codesrir, you meet Claxo, you meet those institutions. And so there are not many forums in which we can work together. Yeah. Okay, so then on that note into the future, I thank you again. I mean, we can be, I think, very safe to say that since the ACSS is a partner of our project, we will not see you for the last time this week, but that there will be hopefully more visits to come. Thank you all for coming and attending, and thank you, Seteney. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.